Monkey's paw. On a cold and stormy night, Mr. White and his son, Herbert, were playing chess in their small living room of villa. While Mrs. White was sitting by the fire, knitting and talking to them occasionally. They were expecting a guest named Sergeant Morris, who was a family friend and had been posted in India, and was back after completing his tenure. "There he is," said Herbert, hearing the gate shut loudly and heavy footsteps coming to the door. "Sergeant Major Morris," said Mr. White, introducing him. Mr. White welcomed Morris and offered him a drink. The family was mesmerized by Morris' description of India. "I'd like to go to India myself," said the old man, "just to look round a bit, you know. I'd like to see those old temples and magic," continued Mr. White. "What was that about a monkey's paw or something you started telling me about the other day, Morris?" Sergeant showed them a dried monkey's paw which had a spell put on it. Morris said, "An old fakir put a spell on it, and now it is a talisman. He was a very holy man, and he wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that to interfere with fate only caused deep sadness. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could have 3 wishes each from it. It would bring a disaster," continued Sergeant. "It has caused enough trouble already," and threw the paw upon the fire. But Mr. White was curious and wanted to test the powers of the monkey's paw. He bent down and quickly retrieved it from the fire. He said, "If you don't want it, give it to me." Morris, after reluctantly explaining the appropriate manner for making the wishes, warned him that he could have the paw but at his own risk, and departed soon afterwards. After the guest left, Mr. White held the paw in his hand and said, "I wish for £200. It moved," he cried, glancing with disgust at the object on the floor. "As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake." The next morning, a gentleman knocked on the door. "I come from Marv and Meggins, your son's employer." The old lady looked surprised. "Is anything wrong?" she asked breathlessly. "Has anything happened to my son, Herbert?" "What is it?" The visitor looked down. "Badly hurt," he said quietly. "But he's not in any pain." "Oh, thank God for that." But the sinister meaning of the visitor's assurance suddenly became clear to the old lady, and she looked at him. His face was turned away, confirming her worst fears. She caught her breath and put her trembling hand on her husband's. There was a long silence. The stranger expressed grief and handed over an envelope containing some amount of money as compensation. Mr. White gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words, "How much?" £200 was the answer. Mr. White found it very difficult to comprehend and became unconscious. He was filled with sorrow at the turn of events. His wish was granted at the cost of his son's life. After a few days, Mrs. White had demanded the monkey's paw as she wanted to make a wish and had her son back. "I wanted," she said. "Why?" "I only just thought of it," she said hysterically. "The other 2 wishes. Why didn't I think of it before?" she replied rapidly. "What wish?" he asked. "Wish our boy alive again." "Bring him back," cried the old woman. Mr. White explained that not only had Herbert been dead 10 days, but also that his body had been decayed beyond recognition. But his wife pulled him towards the door. "Bring him back. Do you think I'm frightened of my own son?" Mr. White took out the monkey's paw and raised his hand. I wish my son alive again. The paw fell on the floor and after few moments a knock was heard at the floor. Who could that be? Enquired Mr. White. That must be my son, replied the old lady and ran towards the door. Don't let it in, for God's sake, cried Mr. White shivering in fear. You're afraid of your own son. Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert, I'm coming. Mr. White searched frantically for the monkey's paw, fearful of what was likely to happen. As he heard the chain rattling back and the bottom bolt drawing slowly and stiffly from the socket, he found the paw and made his the third and last wish. The sound of knocking stopped at once, though its echoes could be heard within the house. Suddenly there was sound of cracks and thunder. The house started collapsing. The roof, walls and staircase started falling down. They rushed towards the ground and sighed in disappointment and then ran towards main gate of the villa. Outside, the street lamp was spreading its light over a calm and empty road. The spell of the monkey's paw had worked. Sojourner Truth, C.A. 1797 to 1883, was a black American freedom fighter and orator. She was born Isabella Baumfree in Ulster County, New York, the daughter of an African named Baumfree, after his Dutch owner, and a woman called Elizabeth. About the age of 9, she was auctioned off to an Englishman named John Neely. The Neelys understood very little of her Dutch jargon and, as a result, she was often brutally punished for no real reason. Eventually Neely sold her to a fisherman who owned a tavern in Kingston, NY. Here she acquired the idiomatic expressions which came to mark her speech. John J. Dumont, a nearby plantation owner, purchased her next. During her tenure with his family she married and had 5 children. In 1827, after NY had passed an Emancipation Act freeing its slaves, she prepared to take her family away. But Dumont began to show reluctance to this, so she ran away with only her youngest child. She finally wound up in New York City. She worked at menial job and through some friends came under the sway of a religious fanatic named Matthias. During the Civil War, Truth bought gifts for the soldiers with money raised from her lectures and helped fugitive slaves find work and housing. After the war, she continued her tirade for the Lord and against racial injustice, even when old age and ill health restricted her activities to the confines of a Battle Creek, Mick Santorium. She died there on 26 November 1883. She was the first black woman to sue and win against the white. Here is one of her famous speeches entitled As Ain't I a Woman?, which she delivered in the Women's Convention in Akron, Ohio in D.C., 1851. Well, children, where is so much racket, there must be something out of order. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and women at the North, all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children, and seen most all sold off to slavery, and when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? Member of audience whispers, intellect. That's it, honey, what's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint, and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as men, 'cause Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it, the men better let them. Obliged to you for hearing me, and now old Sojourner ain't got nothing more to say. For more videos subscribe our channel. Eduskill by Pritesh Vadgama.